Hello and welcome to lecture 2 for topic 5. And in this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at the elements of a crime. Okay, let's look at the different elements of a crime that your textbook talks about. That when a prosecutor is trying to demonstrate that a person is guilty of the crime which they've been charged for, there are many things that the prosecutor needs to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. The first thing that the prosecutor needs to prove is that they need to prove that the person who's accused or charged with the crime was actually the one that engaged in the criminal act. In other words, they engaged in a guilty act, the Actus Reyes. Proving that the individual was the one who engaged in the criminal act, that alone is not enough for somebody to be actually found guilty of the crime that they're charged with. Most criminal statutes have not just a physical element to it, but it also has a mental element to it as well. And so the prosecutor has to demonstrate that the accused had the intent to commit the act or possessed mens rea, the guilty mind. And that means that the individual knowingly, willfully, and intentionally committed the crime. Okay, they knew what they were doing and they had knowledge of that. The prosecutor has to show that actus reus and mens rea were concurrently present. We'll talk more about what that means in a moment. That the criminal act intent, the mens rea, had either come before the criminal act, or it had to be present at the same time as the criminal act was taking place. Furthermore, the prosecutor needs to show that the defendant's actions, the accused actions, were the cause, or at least the proximate cause of the resulting injury. Okay, and so you have to show that the injury, whether it was the physical injury or the injury to property, somebody's property being taken from them, you have to show that the accused was the one who was the cause of that injury. And then you actually, the crime you're being charged with and that you're being found, potentially guilty for, that has to be based on the actual harm that was caused. It can't be based on what harm you intended to cause, right? You might have just wanted to push somebody, but if you actually pushed somebody and then they fell back and hit their head and died, that is the harm that you caused, and that's the crime that you're going to be charged with, and that's the crime. You have to demonstrate that the individual who is accused actually caused that harm. So let's take a look at each of these elements in more detail. Okay, let's dig in more deeply and look at actus reus. Okay, the first off is that you can't punish people for criminal thoughts. You can only punish them for criminal acts. Okay, so actus reus, so the guilty act. I could sit in my house all day and think about how I want to kill my next door neighbor because they get up at 6 a.m. in the morning to mow their lawn or to use their snowblower waking me up. I can think about that all day if I want. Not that I would think about that. But I can't be prosecuted for a so-called thought crime. However, keep in mind that once you take those thoughts and you put them into action, then you could be criminally prosecuted for that action. And so I could, take that thought and then run across the street and stab my neighbor to death or something like that, right? But another act is if I were to threaten my neighbor, right? I'm going to kill you. I didn't actually do it, but a criminal threat of that nature could potentially be prosecuted. I could conspire with my other neighbors saying, hey, let's take this dude out, right? And then we don't actually do it, but that we've engaged in this criminal conspiracy. Again, that is an action. Perjury, lying on the stand, that those are words or, written things, but those are all actions. So thoughts, can't, it's not an action, but once those thoughts turn into any sort of action, including words or speech, then they can, it becomes actus reus. The act itself must actually be a crime. And so remember in the last lecture, we talked about substantive criminal law, that behaviors only become crimes when state laws, state statutes or criminal code at the federal level says that this behavior is actually a crime. So you can engage in immoral or deviant behaviors, but that unless it's actually a crime, then you couldn't be prosecuted. So, for example, I could fake a pregnancy in order to get my boyfriend to marry me. But as far as I know, that's actually not in our substantive criminal law in the state of Wisconsin. Now, if I faked a pregnancy and then used that fake pregnancy to defraud the state of, let's say, health benefits or financial benefits, then that would become a criminal act because it's codified in state law. Keep in mind that Actus Reyes has to be a voluntary act, and it can include not acting as well. So your textbook uses the example of seizures. If you had a seizure and hit somebody in their face, and that you basically harmed them, an individual couldn't be charged for aggravated assault or some sort of assault because it was an involuntary action. However, if I have seizures and I get behind the wheel of a car and I drive and I kill somebody, then that becomes voluntary because you know you have seizures, you know you shouldn't drive, yet you drove anyways. And it also includes no action when you are legally mandated to take action. And so parents and spouses are legally mandated to take action. So are a contractual relationship like a lifeguard, babysitters. So if I came home and heaven forbid my husband is having a heart attack and I was like, not going to do anything about it, I could be criminally prosecuted for that. Okay, let's look at mens rea, the guilty mind. So as I mentioned in the last slide, for an act to be criminal, the person must have intended to commit the crime. In other words, they must have acted knowingly, willingly, recklessly, with some forethought, okay? They must have some clear knowledge of the consequences of their actions, and they must want or desire those consequences to happen. Now, when we get to talking about criminal defenses and excuse defenses, that defense attorneys try to call into question whether or not this person actually knew the consequences of their actions or actually knowingly engaged in the actions, okay? Now, keep in mind that mens rea is legally present even in reckless or negligent behavior, okay? So, just because you really didn't intend for something to happen doesn't mean that you didn't possess mens rea and can be held criminally liable for that. So, for example, if you engage in, let me give you an example. This is the example I always give in class. It's about taking care of a baby, okay? Now, let's imagine that I had a baby. It's crying and I want it to stop crying, and I'm like, I know what's going to help it stop crying. I'm going to throw it up in the air and like it's going to start laughing and having a good time. Now if you saw my house here, I've got really low ceilings, okay? So you can just sort of imagine, I'm like, here's the baby and I'm throwing it up in the air and I'm throwing it up in the air, and then I throw it up in the air and you know, it smashes its head, falls to the ground, okay? Well, that's reckless behavior. I should have known that if I threw a baby up in the air in a room that has really low ceilings, or like Michael Jackson dangling the baby off of a balcony, right? That's reckless. You should have known that something could go wrong and that great harm could come from it. And so I didn't intend to, when I was throwing the baby up, to hurt it, right? But I was engaging in reckless behavior, and that constitutes mens rea. A negligent is sort of careless behavior, right? Reckless is like anyone would have known throwing a baby up like that could have caused some sort of harm. A negligent behavior is just when you're careless, and it's going to come with a lesser criminal penalty. So the baby example of negligent is, let's say you picked up your kid, you had a long day of work, you picked up your kid from daycare, and then you're bringing the kid home, and the kid's still in its like baby seat or whatever, it's car seat. And then you come home, you got groceries in one hand, you got the baby in the other hand, and then you're just like, the dog's barking, you're like losing your mind. So you put the baby up on the counter, right? And then you turn to like start putting the groceries away, and then the dog knocks over the baby falls on the ground and hurts themselves. That's still negligent, right? Because it's careless, but it's going to come with a lesser criminal penalty, but it still constitutes mens rea. Now, keep in mind, your textbook talks about that for some crimes, they're called strict liability crimes, that you don't need to prove mens rea to prove a person is guilty of the crime. All you need to do is prove actus reus. You don't have to prove mens rea. You don't have to prove intent. Some examples of strict liability are statutory rape, selling alcohol to minors, okay? And the reason that you don't have to prove intent is because, well, one, nobody's going to say they intended to have sex with a 15 or 14-year-old, right? You're going to say, I had no idea that person was underage. Same with selling alcohol. You say, I had no idea that person was underage. So actually, to make that criminal offense have more teeth, you say, oh, unfortunately or fortunately, if you're looking to protect minors, all the person needs to do is engage in the act, right? And that in itself, that guilty as charged, okay? You don't have to prove intent, because either intent's always going to be denied, or it doesn't matter what you intended it to do because the harm was so great, having sex with a minor or selling alcohol to a minor. Now, the concurrence of mens rea and actus reus is a little bit getting in the weeds, okay? But it's in your textbook, so I thought we'd go over it anyways. That, as I mentioned before, the criminal intent must precede or coexist with the criminal act. Actus reus must coexist or precede mens rea. But a good criminal defense attorney might want to demonstrate that maybe the intent came afterwards, or that the intent was so far removed from the criminal act that you can't say that there was sort of a concurrence of that. Here's just two. These are the examples I've given in the past. So kind of just keep these in mind. That so the concurrence of mens rea and actus reus is, okay, I want to kill my boss with my car. I hate my boss. In fact, I studied my boss's walking patterns for weeks. I know when they're going to cross the street after work. I'm waiting there, and then I drive my car into them and kill them. Okay, so mens rea, the intent, clearly came before the actual actus reus. Even if I was sort of like at a crosswalk, and then I saw my boss, and I really wasn't intending in advance to kill my boss. All these examples, you're probably thinking, what's wrong with Professor Hankinson, right? But I saw my boss crossing the street, and I'm like, here's my opportunity, and then I, ran my car into them and killed them. And that's still the concurrence of mens rea, because the mens rea took place at the moment of the actus reus. Okay. Now, the non-concurrence of mens rea, actus reus, criminal defense attorney might, try to raise doubt around this. But here's an example. It's not the best example, but it goes with that case study, the example I gave in the previous, in the concurrence. So imagine that I'm driving down the street and a person steps in front of my car. And so I'm just driving and I'm just really not paying attention. Maybe I'm just a little bit spaced out, a hard day at work. I'm driving my car, and then somebody kind of jumps out in front of my car, and I hit them and I kill them. And then I get out and I'm like, oh, gee whiz, it's my boss. He's dead. And then maybe later in the day, I'm sort of like, you know what? I really hated my boss. I'm kind of glad they're dead, right? Well, the mens rea, the intent, just wasn't even related to the actus reus, right? It happened afterwards. You might really be happy that your boss is dead, right? And in fact, I might tell my husband, geez, I really feel bad that the person who got in front of my car was my boss. I didn't even know that it was my boss. I'm not too bad. I'm not too upset that he's dead, right? Well, that couldn't be used against me because that mens rea happened well after the actus reus. All right, so thanks for sticking with me on those kind of crazy examples. It's the best I could do. Okay, the last thing we're going to take a look at here before we move on to looking at the criminal defenses is causation and harm. So the person's criminal act actually must be the cause of injury, and a prosecutor needs to demonstrate that the actus reus resulted in the injury that they are being charged with, okay? And so that sometimes it's really easy to demonstrate in a court of law as a prosecutor that an absolute cause. So, for example, if A shoots B, okay, so Bobby has a gun, points the gun at James, pulls trigger, bullet goes in James dies, okay, there's no doubt that the action of shooting resulted in that person's injury and death. that so you would be charged with homicide. Let's say Bobby, or whatever I was calling him, Bobby robs James. And James is terrified out of his gourd, right? And so he runs away from Bobby, the robber. And James runs into the street and, oh man, gets hit by a car and dies. Okay. Um, that's what you're going to be charged with. You didn't intend to kill James, right? You just intended to rob James, but that doesn't matter. You are the cause of that. Possible cause, let's say Bobby robs James. James is really frightened, but he gets away. Later in the day, James dies of a heart attack. Okay. Well, prosecutor could make that case, but that would maybe be easier for a defense attorney to poke holes into. Probably not cause. Bobby robs James. Later in the day, James is making toast and he gets electrocuted by his toaster and dies. Okay. That's probably Bobby is probably not responsible for James's death. Although a good prosecutor could maybe say that James was so freaked out by the robbery that he was shaking and that he was putting the toast in and his fingers got stuck and he got zapped, right? But that's a little bit, it would take a magical prosecutor to do that. So keep in mind, it's not the intended harm, but it's the actual harm that determines the crime. So you could have intended to stab a person to death, but you're really bad at stabbing, okay? And so you injured the person that you didn't kill the person. And so you would not be charged with homicide, but you wouldn't be charged with attempted homicide, right? On the flip side of that, you could, I like the example before. I only intended to rob this person. I didn't intend to kill them. I only intended to punch somebody, but I didn't intend to kill them or gravely harm them. It doesn't matter what you intended. It's the actual harm that's going to determine the crime that you're charged with. Okay, so keep those in mind as we move into looking at the criminal defenses. Okay, that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to take a look at the second half of chapter 4. We're going to be taking a look at criminal defenses. We'll look at excuse defenses and justification defenses. And so looking at the elements of the crime, we kind of look at it from a prosecutorial perspective. Next week, we'll be looking at it from the defense attorney's perspective. And then we're also going to be learning about procedural criminal justice. And we'll look at all the due process that is guaranteed to those who are accused of a crime. All right, thanks for paying attention, and I'll talk to you again soon.